Video games might not seem particularly important, but for tens of millions of kids in China, they serve as a lifeline. They are the sole form of escapism from a life of academic stress and cram schools, and it is precisely for that reason that this is an evil, immoral policy that has immiserated people and struck at the very hearts of their freedom. We are incredibly proud to oppose. Firstly, on the principle, then on kids, then on the economy. Let's start with the principle. This policy represents a massive imposition. It requires anyone who wants to play a video game to hand over important parts of their biometric information, to engage in facial scanning, to form accounts, to give their information to both the government and to the companies that produce these games, just in order to be able to play a video game. And it further restricts many people, those under 16, from being able to play those games for more than an hour a day on Fridays and the weekends. The effect of that is substantial. We say that it is illegitimate for the government to do so. Individual autonomy and agency matter, and different people value different things in life. It is precisely that diversity that makes life meaningful and beautiful. This is a policy that attempts to squeeze out the ability of people to pursue their own conception of the good life. There are three possible justifications affirmative might have for why it is okay to restrict people's agency in this way. Firstly, they may say, well, they're kids, so it's okay to restrict their freedom. We restrict kids' freedom all the time. Two responses to this. Firstly, the scope of this policy does not just restrict kids' freedom. In its enforcement, it restricts the rights of adults too, who are forced to hand over information and engage in this monitoring system. Secondly, while kids' rights are restricted, we generally recognize that it's the right of parents to make choices about how those rights are restricted, not the right of the government. This infringes not just on the rights of kids, but on their parents, who are now no longer in control. Secondly, they might say that China is a country that often infringes on rights. What difference does some minor restrictions on video games make? But the fact that Chinese government restricts people's rights in other regards ought not justify a further expansion and erosion of what little freedom remains. Two wrongs do not make a right, and the fact that there is precious little freedom for many of these people just makes what remains far more valuable and makes makes eroding that freedom far worse. Finally, they might say this policy is necessary. There is a problem of addiction, or poor posture, or overuse of gaming, or whatever it might be, such that the government is legitimate to intervene. But firstly, we would point out that it is not clear that just because there is some problem the government is attempting to fix, that it justifies any tool that might fix that policy. Secondly, we point out that it's very unlikely this policy will be successful in fixing that particular problem, or that that problem existed in the first place. Parents are very likely to not want their kids to be addicted, they want to look after their kids' health anyway, and in particular, Asian parents are highly unlikely to be allowing their kids to spend dozens of hours a week engaging in video gaming. But finally, we would note that even if this policy did solve the problem, that doesn't justify the scale to which this strikes against freedom. So, we think that this is just principally immoral. We think that there is a very high burden on the affirmative team to justify why we should give up the freedoms that this policy would require, and that is why you should side against it. And secondly, this is bad for children. Video games are a crucial form of entertainment for many kids, and maybe the affirmative team will say, well, there are other ways you can entertain yourself or relax. That is true, but it is important that different people value different forms of entertainment. So while there might be other forms of entertainment, they may be worse for many kids. And the fact that kids engage in gaming so much suggests that there is a revealed preference that this is a particularly valuable form of relaxation and escapism for them. But secondly, the existence of alternatives does not justify government intervention. The fact that apples exist does not mean that the government ought to be free to ban pears because you could just eat apples instead. Additionally, we'll provide 6 reasons why gaming is uniquely valuable and therefore ought be allowed. Firstly, it is a form of escapism. Unlike other forms of recreation, it allows you to totally immerse yourself in another world and leave behind your problems. Secondly, it is a world of unique agency. You can play different characters, you can engage in actions that would never be possible in the real world. Thirdly, there is anonymity in the absence of this system, so you can engage with people without having them know who you are, without having the baggage of your real life. Fourthly, it's often incredibly cheap to access in a way that other forms of recreation aren't, particularly in a country that is poor and where access to facilities is often limited. But fifthly, it's far more accessible than other things. People increasingly live in, for example, very dense urban areas where it's difficult to move around, or they live in rural parts of China where there is very little infrastructure or very little access to other facilities. Gaming is something that can be done anywhere. And finally, notably, this is a policy that was implemented at the height of COVID, when China had zero COVID lockdowns and people were prevented from doing the vast majority of things. Gaming was one of the few solaces that they had left. So, for those reasons, gaming is a uniquely valuable form of pleasure. Often there aren't substitutes, but even if they were, people ought to have a right to engage in their preferred form of relaxation. They ought to have the right to engage in that very meaningful activity that brought them so much joy. Finally, this was terrible for the economy. We would note empirically it created the value of companies like Tencent, and that is for three reasons. Firstly, because Tencent relies substantially on gaming revenues, and this policy suggested that, for example, you would not be able to gain the vast majority of that revenue because your main customer base of kids is no longer allowed to play your games in the vast majority of instances and can play them far less. They'll spend far less on them. Secondly, it came amidst the context of a broader crackdown on the tech and edutech sectors. Thirdly, for the reason that it occurred in the middle of the COVID recession that meant the business climate was already weak. And importantly, since then, growth has been incredibly slow and deflation has taken hold in China. What that means is that it's been terrible for the economy writ large. It's taken some of the most liberal and progressive sectors and indicated that the government doesn't approve of them, which is why, for example, capital has flown out of the tech sector and towards new productive forces that are the kinds of companies that Xi believes should be invested in, mainly heavy manufacturing, and why the most talented individuals who worked for these companies have often moved overseas to countries like the US where they can engage in, for example, working on video games or working on tech more broadly. This was an indication the CCP would not liberalize and would not tolerate the kinds of activities they wanted to engage in. Notably, a part of this policy was to also ban effeminate characters, clearly striking against LGBT audiences, clearly indicating that the Chinese government did not approve of liberalization or people's freedom to choose for themselves. What are the impacts of this policy? Firstly, it's terrible for the gaming industry, which harms not just kids, but adults who want to game. When there is far less money in this industry, there's far fewer games, there's far less development of those games. Secondly, it hurts broader economic growth in China. We would note that this was one of the most productive, innovative, and brightest sectors of the economy, and it's now been entirely crushed, both because people don't want to invest because they fear the CCP looks poorly upon it, but also because it is far harder to make money within this sector. And that matters, because China is a poor country, so any marginal increase in growth is incredibly valuable, but particularly so for the poorest people in China, who would have more money, where the government would have more money to engage in redistribution to them when the economy grew faster. But additionally, it contributes to things like high youth unemployment and, for example, less money for the government to spend on a rapidly aging population that is going to be in incredible need of social safety net very soon. And finally, it contributes to the toxic competition that exists because there are so few jobs, because there are so many people, because there is so little wealth to go around. That is precisely why people feel so stressed and why people feel like there is so much competition. This is a policy that strikes against kids, it strikes against the economy, and it strikes against freedom, which is precisely why we're so proud to oppose it.